morning, everyone. I might want to start by saying good morning, and my name is Dr. Angelique Anderson. I just want to thank Martha for that robust introduction that she gave. And then I also want to begin by offering respect to the Susuni people on whose land we occupy within Solano County, and that's where I currently do my work. And so I want to thank each of you today for being present and on time, and let's get started on this very robust topic of historical framework on traditional African American parenting and discipline. As we begin, I want to give a disclaimer. There'll be 3 moments that you would assuredly experience today. Number 1, there'll be some trigger moments, which are related to experiences of trauma, whether you have experienced them primarily for yourself or vicariously through the populations that you work with or personal interrelationships that you have. So for very triggering moments, I'll do my best to offer trigger warnings, and please do your best to take care of yourself. If that's stepping away or doing whatever stress or mindfulness activities that work best for you for taking care of yourself. The second thing that you're going to experience are ouch moments. And those are moments where we highlight moments of hurt or discomfort. And it doesn't mean that you personally did something, but just a reality that might be uncomfortable for you. And number 3 are aha moments, which are referring to any revelations that you might be having, any epiphanies that come up for you, or just anything that you'll be taking away from you, taking away from this experience today and implementing in your work. So as we move forward in this presentation, I encourage you to be vulnerable and allow yourself to experience each of these 3 things, allowing yourself to be vulnerable to what we're going to be talking about today. So the second disclosure I want to make is that when we look at the African American community, we want to recognize that they're not a homogenous community. So that means that every Black family, every Black person that you come across is very, very different. That can go from the demographics that they grew up in. It can go from what part of the country they grew up in, or just variances of what their personal beliefs are. And so this particular presentation is talking about particular African Americans that have historically utilized physical discipline. And so obviously that's not every parenting group, but that's typically what we're going to be focusing on today. So I want to begin our presentation by unifying what our foundational definition of parenting is. Most people think about parenting in terms of caretaking or teaching morals or religious beliefs or what your personal values are, but it's a little bit more deep than that. According to research, one of the primary goals of parenting is to implant values, beliefs, and ideas around lifestyles based on one's cultural knowledge of the adult tasks and competencies that are going to be needed to function in society that you live in. So as we are continuing on with working our definitions to having a foundational principle and what this means, when we look at physical discipline is described by the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry as physical punishment, sometimes called corporal punishment, and is anything done to cause pain or discomfort in response to a child's behavior. Some examples that we see with that are spanking, which is one of the most common forms of physical punishment, slapping, pinching, pulling, hitting with an object such as a paddle, a spoon, a belt, an extension cord, a hairbrush, a whip, or a stick. And another not so talked about form of physical discipline is making someone eat soap, hot sauce, hot pepper, or other unpleasant substances. If you look at this chart highlighting the 2014 thoughts of a good hard spanking by whites, non-Hispanic Blacks, and Latinx population, we can see that non-Hispanic Black African Americans were higher in relaying the sentiment when compared to their counterparts. And that's factored into the second part of the graph there. And so as we go on this journey of looking at historical context, it's important to realize that the practice of physical discipline is not a phenomenon indigenously found in African cultures. Historians and anthropologists have found no evidence that ritualistic forms of physical discipline of children existed in pre-colonial African societies prior to the transatlantic slave trade. In fact, there's significant evidence indicating that intentional, non-physical based parenting was the standard of pre-colonized African countries. So we can see this when we look at the Nigerian proverbs that states, "A shepherd does not strike his sheep." And so we're going to begin with going into our first activity in our breakout session. So I know that Martha had emailed everyone out this particular packet that talks about African views on parenting. And so I don't know if you all have had an opportunity to look at it, but what you'll do is when you get in your small groups, you'll, number one, introduce yourself and the agency and your role there. And then you'll pick one or two African proverbs that speak to you and resonate with you personally and explain to your group why. So I'm going to stop sharing now and allow for Martha to do that.
Okay, so I'm going to send everybody into breakout rooms, and I put the handout and the 2 prompts in the chat, so that should follow you into your breakout rooms. If you have questions when you're in there, you can call me in and I can help you out. So give me one moment. All right, so I'm going to send you into your rooms and you will have 8 minutes and there will be a timer counting down. So keep track of that as well. Okay. There you go. Welcome back, everybody. Dr. Anderson, I don't know where you went, but everybody's back. So you're somewhere in here.
I'm here.
Okay, there you are. Okay.
So great. Thank you, everyone, for participating in your breakout sessions. Is there anyone that would like to share kind of what their group discussed?
Yeah, I'm Lydia Madrano. I'm from Miller Children's Hospital. Welcome, baby. I think one of them that stood out, sorry, I'm gonna look really fast, sorry, is the one of where sorry, I'm losing it right now. Don't put, sorry, I think I've had it. Oh, what a child says he has heard from home. I think that resonates for me growing up. It's like, for my parents, it was always like, be careful what you say at school, in the community. What stays in the house stays in the house. I think that resonates a lot with me. And because of course we growing up, we're little sponges. We hear, see, and tell everything. It doesn't even matter if it's innocent or not. So I think growing up, that was one of the things that I've always remembered in the community, or going to like a church gathering or whatever, like, okay, best behavior, know what you're, don't say what you're not supposed to say, or otherwise when you get home, you kind of get in trouble. So I think that resonates with me growing up, and it kind of hits home and stuff. So, and I always educate my clients with children are learning and are exploring everything in their environment. And one of the things is that parents are role models for them. And just putting it out there for them to realize what they do and say, and nonverbal, or anything that the children do see, even your emotions off sense anything from them. So I just educate parents on that area so they can know, like, it is true, and they will say innocently things out there that, even if they're not seen wrong, but some people can see two other ways wrong too. So that's what thank you.
Any other group here to share?
Hi, good morning, everyone. The one that I discussed was a stick is straightened while still young. And that one resonated or stood out for me just because I've worked with preschoolers, and I have a niece and nephew, and I know that oftentimes people interpret behavior as good or bad. And so instead of focusing on what's good or bad, really seeing the underlying message and trying to be patient with the child, and seeing that all behavior really is a need and the child doesn't have the tools. So then giving them the tools to communicate those needs or decipher those feelings so that in the future they have these great tools instead of punishing them and shaming them, and then trying to rectify the ramifications of the parents doing so, either the punishment or the shame, all those underlying feelings as an adult, which is a lot harder.
Thank you. Great, rich conversation. Thank you, everyone.
Can I share one of them?
Yes, please.
The one I was thinking and I shared with my group is number 14, you cannot beat a child to take away its tears. And I was mentioning how, you know, in at least in my household, it was sort of like a thing where it kind of got warped. Instead of being that, it was like the opposite of like, calm down or I'll calm you down. You know, like either you can stop crying on your own or I'm going to make you stop crying, you know? And so usually that ended up being some form of, you know, pinching, hitting, something to make you calm down. So I thought it was interesting how sometimes these amazing proverbs, you know, with time and then just so much trauma that communities have faced, then they end up kind of being warped into something completely opposite of what, you know, what it was intended to be.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And we're going to be definitely discussing that in a bit. Thank you. And it's interesting to see that shared historical frameworks from different communities. Thank you. Okay, bear with me. I'm going to try to share my screen again. Let's see how this works. Oh, one moment, everyone.
Okay, looks great.
Okay, one day I'll get it. It's not quite where I need it to be on my end, but okay, let's try this one more time.
While you're doing that, in the meantime, I will just remind everybody, if you have questions and that are coming up, please go ahead and put them in the chat and I'll bring them up at the end for the Q&A. So just as things are coming up, we can keep a record of that too.
Okay, how's it looking?
Looks great.
Okay, great. Alrighty. So now we're going to put a little bit of more contextual meat on the bone and answer some questions as to why there is a prevalence of physical discipline in the African American community. So once in America, enslaved parents were under a tremendous amount of pressure to shape their children into docile field workers. So they were forced to obey and stay in line because their identity and their behavior were considered to be a direct reflection of their slave owner and the plantation that they lived on. Enslaved African people that were not compliant were a poor reflection of the slave masters and the overseers, which meant that they were not able to properly lead their slaves, which was a social taboo that you cannot handle your slaves. As an observed adaptation, which is very similar to what we call as social Darwinism, after observing the occurrences of slave owners beating the enslaved children, the slave parents would physically discipline their children first to keep them in line as a preventative measure to more punitive beatings from the slave master or from their children being sold away and separated from their parents, never to be seen again. So the author Stacey Patton talks about it specifically and outright says African Americans adopted the practice of beating from their white slave masters. So plainly put, traditional views of physical discipline have a direct reflection on slavery. Specifically, physical discipline is utilized to protect children from white harm, help them to survive in a hostile world that doesn't have their best interest at heart, instilling fear for their parents and authority figures, and also as a means of raising obedient, passive children who respect authority in all situations, whether that authority figure is right or wrong. And so we'll be discussing this in a little bit more detail a few slides down from here. So we're going to be viewing a clip from Dr. Stacey Patterson and her agency, which is called Spare the Kids. Dr. Patton was physically disciplined by her middle-class parents, which resulted in her becoming a dependent ward of the New Jersey Child Protective System. She often begins her speeches by identifying herself saying, "I am case number KC 114343 of the New Jersey foster care system." And this is her way of recognizing that her experience of physical abuse from her parents, as well as being a ward of the New Jersey foster care system, has been a huge factor in her life and has also guided her work in making sure that this practice is eradicated in all communities, but specifically for African American communities. So this video is quite disturbing. And so for some people, this would be an opportunity for you to do what you need to do, whether that's step away, do what you need to do to take care of yourself at this moment.
Dr. Anderson, the sound is really low. Is anybody else not hearing it? Okay, I was seeing. Sorry.
Can you hear it at all?
We can hear it a little, it's just very far away.
Okay, let me make sure that I'm sharing my sound. Oh, it wasn't shared. That would be the reason. So let's try that again.
Thanks.
Thank you for letting me know.
Sure.
Black people have been parenting, legally parenting their children for only 150 years. Now, if you factor in Jim Crow, it's only 50 years. Toya Graham was not a hero for chasing down, cursing out, and assaulting her son on national television. Get the f over here! But I empathized with her fear. I understood why she needed to intervene in that moment. What I was disgusted by was the media circus created by it. We need you to be a mammy, that bridge between the interests of a white authority and your thug son. But I empathized with her fear. I understood why she needed to intervene in that moment. What I was disgusted by was the media circus created by it. We need you to be a mammy, that bridge between the interests of a white authority and your thug son.
Black people hit their child 92 times. in the eye, in the nuts, in the feet. That's where the real pop locking came from. I will fuck a kid up.
All right, Dr. Anderson, now it's
Don't
frozen, I think.
I'm just saying what you can't.
What did you say? I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, it's frozen now on the Anderson Cooper photo.
Yeah, let's see if we can.
I can try to play it on mine too if it, but
That would be great if you could do that.
you want me to try? Okay.
Yeah, let me stop sharing.
It might be the connection in general. We'll give it a shot. Let's see. Okay. I don't know if this will be better, everybody, but thanks for bearing with us. Okay.
That moment, what I was disgusted by was the media circus created by it. We need you to be a mammy, that bridge between the interests of a white authority and your thug son.
It seems like it's frozen again.
It is.
I'm
So
sorry.
what I can do, that's okay. What I can do, technology working against us won't let us be great. I can put the link in the chat, and that way people have an opportunity to, if they choose, watch on their own terms.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for your patience.
Let me just put that in there really quick. Actually, I'll just, I won't take time to do that right now, but I will do that definitely by the end of the presentation. Alrighty. Okay, thank you for bearing with us. So one of the reasons that we're going to talk about is traditionalism. So parenting styles, and specifically for the purpose of this presentation, the utilization of physical discipline has a lot to do with traditionalism. So when we think about parenting, most parents raise their children in the way that their parents raised them, and they don't think about it much. So they don't assess why their parents chose to do what they did. They just kind of continue with the tradition to do so. So when we think about this, a great example of this would be the story that I'm going to tell. So one day, there was a long-standing story of a young woman who was helping her mother prepare the Thanksgiving dinner. And the mother cut the ends off of each side of the ham prior to seasoning it. So the young lady asked her mother why she cut off the ends of the ham, and the mother replied that she cut off the ends of the ham because that's what her mom always did. The young woman went into the living room where the grandmother was relaxing and asked her why she had cut the ends off of the ham. And the grandmother explained, because when she was young and a struggling cook, she had to cut the ends off of the ham because her hand-me-down pan was too small to fit the entire ham in it. So she resorted to cutting off the ends so the entire ham could fit into that particular pan. So you see that this there was a generational reason for cutting off the ham, and one generation from the next didn't have an idea as to why it was happening in the first place. So when we think about traditionalism, we can also think about the one-finger hall pass, which is a practice found in predominantly Black churches for people to put up their finger and bow their head when going to the restroom or exiting the church. This typically occurred within the Black church for centuries. This practice originated during slavery when enslaved people would excuse themselves to go to the restroom, and putting their finger up signified that they had received permission from their slave master to use the restroom, and it was not an attempt for them to run away or be defiant. Although this practice has been more recently dismantled through education of why it was originally done, it can still be seen practiced in many churches. Statistics
Okay,
support that one.
Sorry, your slides aren't showing. I'm not sure if you want them to be, but
Oh, I'm sorry.
it's
Yes.
okay.
Let me try that again.
Your story was, I'm not sure you needed it for the story, but
Let's try that again.
we're jumping all around today with our technology.
It
Feels like a
won't let us
Monday or
be
something.
great.
Okay, 1 second.
Okay. So I'll just kind of give the optics, but I won't go over the story again. So that was the story about the ham and the one finger hall pass. Okay. So when we talk about traditionalism, we also find that statistics support that one's history is a strong determining factor about what one's future will look like. But as we know, this is not a hopeless thing. And all the work that we're doing in our various positions lends credence to the fact that our parents' viewpoints can change based on our interaction with them and providing good information and modeling different ways of parenting based on where we are in society. And so we're going to base that on the quote that talks about from Dr. Cornel West, and it says, "Our roots help determine our roots." And it's a play on words. One of the things that we will also want to talk about as we're discussing the why is what a term we call Eurocentrism. And Eurocentrism is defined as the focus on European culture, history, or experiences while excluding the wider worldview of other racial or ethnic groups. And so basically when we look at our history books in our country, they're very Eurocentric in the thinking. So that tends to lend what we're going to talk about pretty soon. It often values European culture or history as the first in achieving accomplishments or in terms of it being more supreme or more important than any other group. And then Eurocentrism is also utilized typically as a litmus paper to judge or compare if other cultures are doing things the right way or living up to a standard of white culture. So typically we see that when we want to think about beauty, when we talk about family traditions, when we talk about family dynamics and makeup. Typically what we're judging many people in our society on is based on Eurocentric thoughts of that thing. And so when we also want to talk about is religion. In addition to slavery roots, there are also a religious context that we want to consider when we think about physical discipline. So religion is definitely an important component of the African American community. We often look into it in terms of a strong tie to our resilience and hope. So when we consider biblical scriptures, people oftentimes have a literal interpretation of the scripture. And one of the most notable scriptures that are utilized to reinforce the notion of physical discipline, we look at the particular scripture, Proverbs 13:24, which states, "Whoever spares a rod hates his son, but who loves him is diligent to discipline him." And so when we think about this in terms of religion, religion was oftentimes used to manipulate African Americans and enslaved African Americans to justify slavery and the physical abuse that happened underneath it. And so with that came also the utilization and manipulation of scripture to justify it. But when we look at it, historians often now determine that when they say spare the rod, it is definitely a figurative speech which talks about the lack of discipline and doesn't mean a physical rod to hit your child. When we also talk about religious views, it's also significant. I spoke about it a minute ago, but when we look at Minister Nat Turner, who was often utilized by slave owners to contract with other slave owners to preach to enslaved Black people, particularly scriptures to justify continuing slavery, kowtowing to slave masters. And Nat Turner was he wasn't a learned man by trade, but he did have a relationship with God and knew that what he was doing was not okay. And so when he did that, there was an insurrection, which is also known as the greatest slave insurrection in US history, which he turned it around and used true forms of Christianity to say why slavery was not okay and why the functioning of the US was not as God intended it to be. As we continue looking at religion, we can see that the red line indicates views on spanking from born-again Christians who historically has been significantly higher than those that do not identify as being Christians, which is the blue line. So we're gonna take a moment. This film is not as graphic as the last, but definitely do what you need to do to take care of yourself.
The work that lies ahead for the NFL expanded to include not only addressing domestic assault against a female partner, but also domestic violence against children. After Minnesota Vikings player Adrian Peterson was charged with injury to a child after he used a wooden switch and a belt to spank his son. Now, here's what Goodell had to say in response to a question about Peterson at the press conference.
What's your message to the mother with the 2 kids who has Peterson jerseys and doesn't know what to tell them?
Well, the first thing is that we're like the broader society in several ways. We're like a microcosm of society. While I'm disappointed in what Adrian Peterson was involved with, we want to see the facts, but I think what we see so far is tragic. It's hard to look at. I have 2 daughters who are 13. It's very difficult to see. And I think what we have to do is allow those facts to proceed. But the important message, I think, for all of us as parents is that our children are going to make mistakes. They need to learn how to take responsibility and be accountable for those mistakes and deal with those.
But Goodell doesn't have to look far for the facts he wants to see, because we know at least one fact that Peterson himself has admitted to in a statement, quote, "I have to live with the fact that when I disciplined my son the way I was disciplined as a child, I caused an injury that I never intended or thought would happen." Adrian Peterson punished his 4-year-old child with enough force to cause him to be injured. That is the fact. And yet, so are these. Fact, a majority of Americans, nearly 70%, according to the University of Chicago's General Social Survey, support the use of corporal punishment to discipline a child. Fact, although there is a somewhat higher percentage of African Americans who support corporal punishment, it is also a fact that supports for corporal punishment is not, in fact, discriminated in by race. A 73% majority of white Americans also think spanking a child is an acceptable form of punishment. Other racial groups are only slightly less likely, by a matter of just 5 points, than white Americans to approve of spanking, which leaves us with this final fact. The national consensus around violence against women, our collective agreement that it is not okay to use unprovoked physical force, especially against a smaller, more vulnerable person, does not apply to the smallest, most vulnerable people among us. Joining me now is Camilo Ortiz, who is Associate Professor of Psychology at Long Island University, who runs a private practice in Long Island where he treats both adults and children. The Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis, who is Senior Minister at the Middleton Collegiate Church. Dr. Stacy Patton, who is founder of the child advocacy group Spare the Kids and Senior Reporter for the Chronicle of Higher Education. And from Miami, Florida is still Bomani Jones, ESPN commentator and co-host of ESPN2's Highly Questionable. So here is my question. Is corporal punishment the last form of acceptable domestic violence?
Well, I think it is. You know, the stats that you mentioned are pretty breathtaking. Even though 80 to 90% of parents actually do it, a good 70% of them say that they support it. So you have a very small group of people who use corporal punishment who actually think they're doing anything wrong. So this is a, you know, it's hard to get this type of agreement on almost any issue.
It was, for me, stunning to see the difference between the Ray Rice reaction of ordinary people who were like, that's clearly wrong, to the Adrian Peterson reaction, which was, hey, my mama beat me. Why do you think there was such an emphasis on sort of making a claim about the violence that people had experienced in their own childhood?
Because I think there's a kind of nostalgia that's at operation here. You have Ray Rice participating in that nostalgia, saying this is how my mama raised me. I'm successful because of the whippings that I got. Our own president has participated in that nostalgia when he's commented about how once upon a time, if you were acting out, somebody in the community could snatch you up and whip you. And then when you got home, your mother did it as well. I mean, I heard that as a kid, and I thought, thank God you can't do that anymore.
Yeah, right. Clearly, your nostalgic golden age past is a violent one. But so, Bomani, let me come to you on this, because we hear the commissioner saying, well, we are just here in the NFL, we are just a microcosm of society, although the NFL is tax exempt and most of society is not. But that said, I wonder, is there any more likelihood that sort of punishment of one's children using spanking or switches is more or less likely to be supported among NFL players?
Well, I think it's given that that's something that's more supported by the general society, as you noted, that yeah, there's a good chance that the people that we're talking about there hear this and don't understand what the issue is. Most people didn't understand what the issue was on this until they saw the photographs. And it's been interesting that it's been turned into a broader discussion of corporal punishment, wherein even if you are a supporter of corporal punishment, there's no way that you can look at those pictures and think that that was anything appropriate.
So let me come to that kind of picture question, because it does feel to me like the conversation around domestic violence against one's female partner, which is mostly how that conversation has gone, is an absolute. Men don't hit women, full stop. But it is apparently perfectly fine for full-grown adults to wail on children as long as they do so by what would have once called a rule of thumb, right? So with a violent instrument that is only so harsh or heavy, only so violent. Why that distinction?
I think what happens is that's the psychology of violence. That's what happens. Look, I come from a people who spanked. You know, my mom and dad came from Mississippi. They were whipped with switches. They spanked us with belts. The one time that I got beat by my dad was the most terrifying day of my life. And when I had a chance to spank my little brother, who I babysat, I terrified him. I'm convinced that there is an epidemic of violence around the globe, and I'm convinced that it starts in the home. And there's a way in which faith-based people think that somehow the scripture justifies this kind of treatment of our children. You know, spare the rod, spoil the child, which, by the way, is not in the Bible at all.
Right. No. What's in the Bible is suffer the little children to come on to me. And of course, Jesus does not then begin to beat them with a switch. In fact, I do want to just point out that as much as it turned into kind of a race conversation, that somehow this idea that Adrian Peterson was engaging in a set of racial practices, then when we look at it, there's actually a regional gap on spanking, that in the South, there is a much higher percentage of people kind of across the time that the GSS was asking who support spanking. And there is a religious gap, so that born-again Christians are more likely to support spanking than are those who don't see themselves as born-again Christians.
And I think that's about the interpretation of Scripture. You know, you can look in the Scripture and find anything that you want to support what you want to do. But I'm convinced that the only way that we're going to change the spiral of violence is to start in the home and to have an educated and important conversation about what the Scriptures say. The word rod means authority. So a rod that is authority, that is loving, that is gentle, that is compassionate, that believes in timeouts, is a different kind of authority than literally a switch or a spank or a spoon or a fist. And those kinds of violences only pay forward. If a child is beat, a child is going to learn to use might. If a child is kicked, a child is going to only learn to use violence.
All right, so that said, Bomani, I want to bring you one last time here before you have to go. On this topic, I wonder, though, for a profession that needs people to use violence and force, I mean, you're not going to chat with the offensive lineman about whether or not maybe he will get out of your way. Like, that's not how that works in football. If, in fact, there would be reason to think that in the context of this sport, there are more people for whom that is, in fact, a way to solve problems.
No, it does seem reasonable because they do, in fact, make money solving problems in that way. And I thought that led to a fascinating element of this with Peterson, because Peterson has an understanding or a concept of what abuse is, because he said he never beat his kids with an extension cord because he remembered how much that happened to hurt. But you imagine being Adrian Peterson with the threshold of pain that Adrian Peterson has, and then he's translating this over to dealing with children and seemed to have absolutely no clue that what he was doing was so completely out of bounds and out of control. Like, a lot of what we're talking about fits, I think, what people would think that Adrian Peterson would think and would see. And I think that's part of why people got really hopped up about this issue, because their thought was, oh my God, what if Adrian Peterson was the guy beating me with a switch?
Right, right. Much less if I were 4 years old. Bomani Jones in Miami, Florida, thank you for joining us. I'm going to come back and have more.
All right. Take a breath and do what you need to take care of yourself. That was a lot.
The work.
So we can see one of the themes of the previous clip includes that a parent's intention with using corporal punishment may be good for what they think, which may very well differ from the impact and consequences that it has for a child experiencing it on the other end. Research has shown that impact is far more impressing than one's intention. Also, qualitative information also has noted that behavior isn't always reflected of one's emotions or feelings. And so what that typically means is that when one sees that a parent is utilizing physical discipline, they may interpret it as not loving their child or having an abusive tendency, but really there's more to that historically when we look at the African American community. And we're going to dive a little bit more deeper into that now. In addition to cultural context of slavery and traditionalism and religion, there are also societal and cultural realities that are specific for African American community. Black parents have legitimate fears about the safety of their children, and the overwhelming majority believe that physical discipline is necessary to keep their Black children out of the streets, out of prison, or out of the sight of police officers. What we know to be true as a community for centuries is now being unveiled with the use of technology. The fear of law enforcement varies from the issues of the school to prison pipeline, police brutality or murder, and the police tendency to be judge, jury, and executioner. In addition to the utilization of physical discipline and the infamous talk that Black parents have to give to their children about kowtowing to officers in order to avoid being killed. In essence, you need to live so you can address your innocence after the fact. In a recent incident in Sacramento, California, a mother began filming an encounter after a traffic stop that her child was involved in, and could be heard pleading in the video, "My child will not be the next # campaign." Physical discipline is utilized as a means of curtailing misbehavior and perceived misbehavior in school due to statistics supporting that discipline of Black and brown children happen more frequently and more severely than the white and Asian counterparts. Research also supports that Black children are often overlooked or deemed unworthy of advanced placement or consideration for advanced placement in things that we consider like MESA or the GATE program. Research suggests that the modern parents persist in endorsing physical punishment as a way of decreasing defiant or oppositional behaviors to prevent children from endangering themselves and minimize continued misbehavior. Researchers notate that the utilization of physical discipline is more prevalent in lower socioeconomic families as well. We can also see that the differential treatment when we begin to analyze how law enforcement fear Black children with a disproportionate outcomes in choosing when to charge and convict them as an adult, them not being detained without serious injury or being killed, or being convicted more severely than their counterparts. An example that we can note is how Dylan Ruth, the Charlotte 9 terrorist, was able to get food from Burger King drive-thru after being apprehended because he told the officers he was hungry. Another example is the ability of 17-year-old Kyle Rittenhouse, who shot and killed 2 people and injured another in Kenosha, Wisconsin, being able to walk past law enforcement with his weapon in visible sight and to be able to be peaceably apprehended at his home the next day without incident. We can also observe this when the DUI convicted teen, Ethan Couch, was arrested in 2013 for driving while intoxicated and killing 4 pedestrians and only receiving 10 years of probation to what his attorneys described as a term of affluenza. And affluenza is described as being too fragile to be held accountable for your actions because you have been too spoiled or overindulged while growing up. These are all examples of how unequal justice practice that unfairly place Black youth at a disadvantage and reinforce the fears of their parents, which often results in them continuing to use physical discipline. And in addition, we can see the tendency for society, law enforcement, and media sources to vilify victims of police brutality and murders, as opposed to analyzing the dysfunction of the officers or the context that outline the perpetrator's propensity for violence. The utilization of physical discipline by some African Americans are often solely revered as abusive or misguided parenting, but are largely done with the intent of love and having origins of racialized trauma and in a cultural experience. However, we realize that there are implications for physical discipline, which makes this a very complex issue still. So here is a clip from the award-winning show Blackish, displaying the plight of many African American parents and why they still might continue to use physical discipline.
Shh, the lawyer speaking.
It's important in the midst of all the public vilifying of the police department, whose members acted completely within procedure, to remember Mr. McQuillan was no angel.
What?
What does that mean?
Why would they even say that? What does that even mean?
They're talking about somebody's child. That could easily be one of these children here.
That could have been one of us.
No, sweetie, no. Because if you get stopped by the cops, you are gonna do exactly what they say, okay?
She's right. Listen to me. If you have to talk to the cops, there's only 7 words you need to know. Yes, sir. No, sir. And thank you, sir.
Exactly. You make sure you live to fight your case in court. You hear me?
Oh, Mama! Enough! Wake up! Let's say they listen to the cops and get in the car. Look what happened to Freddie Gray.
Yeah, and what if they make it all the way to the station? You remember Sandra Bland?
And let's say they do make it to trial. You see where that gets us? Don't you get it, Bo? The system is rigged against us.
Maybe it is, Dre. But I don't want to feel like my kids are living in a world that is so flawed that they can't have any hope.
Oh, so you want to talk about hope, Bo?
That's a sad reality that many African American parents have to have that conversation with their children. To bring it full circle again, we can reference that quote that we transitioned us into talking about what parenting is. And again, that's the primary goal of parenting is to implant values, beliefs, and ideas based on one's culture, one's experience of what they have to do to thrive in the society that they live in. Another very culturally specific implication is known as the post-traumatic slave syndrome, also known as PTSS, which can be described as a condition of adaptive survival behaviors in African American communities that exist due to multi-generational oppression of Africans and their descendants through centuries of slavery and racism. One of the things that we need to understand that a cultural practice isn't always an organic one, which means it doesn't happen normally within that society without there being outside influences. Many times we see that cultural practices have become normal due to adaptation and survival, and we're going to learn a little bit about that now. Here's a clip from Dr. Joy DeGruy explaining the concept of post-traumatic slave syndrome.
Post-traumatic slave syndrome is an explanatory theory that really looks at multi-generational trauma. One of the things that's difficult for people is their first response is, oh my God, that happened so long ago. We're talking about people being captured, shipped, sold, beaten, raped, experimented on. And then you have to ask the question, did the trauma continue? Yes, so 300 years of trauma, no help, freed. No help, more trauma. If it's a sustained trauma, then the impact of that is also sustained. When we look at multi-generational trauma, we're looking at people who are maybe victims of natural disasters and their families and their children, and generations of folks who have experienced war. And we know that there are residual mental, emotional, traumatic impact. And what I did was I started to look at the African-American experience, starting with slavery, as a real clear, long enduring trauma. I started to see that there were clear connections between that survival behavior and contemporary living in African American experience. I started to see common behaviors that I took for granted as, well, cultural. There's adaptive behaviors, survival behaviors. Well, what are they? Let's just say 2019, you have a black mother and a white mother. The sons go to school together. They find themselves at a meeting. The black mother leans over to the white mother and says, I just wanted to mention to you that I noticed that your son is really doing quite well. And the white mother's response is, oh, thank you. She begins to go on and on about he won the science fair, his uncle's an astronaut. She's just oozing. She realizes the black mother's son is actually excelling her son. And she says, well, wait a minute. Your son's the one that's really coming along. And the black mother responds, oh my God, he's a handful, but oh, he just works my nerves. Now, when I'm working with African American people, it doesn't matter what the audience is. It doesn't matter what class. If I were to ask, is she very proud while she's saying those denigrating things? And everybody laughs and goes, of course, there's a secret. Because everybody black knows that even though the black mother is going, oh my God, she's really proud. So now let's roll that scene back 300 years. And let's say this black mother is working in the fields and a white slave owner comes through and says, wow, that boy is really coming along. What is she gonna say? No, he's not. He's stupid. He's shiftless. He can't work because I don't want you to sell him. So I denigrate them to protect them. That is called appropriate adaptation when living in a hostile environment. The little white boy, say Timmy, he feels really comfortable and happy about what his mom just said about him. And Trey looks at his mom and wonders, why can't you be proud of me? Because he doesn't understand the secret yet. And by the time he learns the secret, he will have already been injured by it. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. PTSD.
So another example we can point out with cultural adaptation to parenting include historical intolerance of Black parents and elders for replying what or huh when their names are being called by an adult. Historically, this stems from a safety factor during and post chattel slavery, when the Ku Klux Klan and other hate groups created terror through invading and burning Black homes and kidnapping and raping and murdering Black people. As a result, when parents called the name of their children, they needed them to come expeditiously without unnecessarily drawing attention through alerting those perpetrators of where they were in the home and taking unnecessarily time out to explain what was happening. So in essence, you cannot say what, you just come to me and I can get you to safety. Another cultural adaptation that we see when we think about Black parenting is the inability for most children to use the term liar. Historically, the integrity of Black people since coming to the Americans has been questioned, especially in terms of them being accused of not telling the truth, which has had dire results during and post-slavery, resulting in various consequences of beating, being sold and separated from their family members during slavery, not being fed, destruction of property, rape, kidnappings, lynching, tarring, and other forms of murder. As a result, there's a tendency for Black children currently to be raised not to use the term liar. Alternatively, they might be encouraged to use terms like telling stories or fibbing or telling a tale. This was a direct reflection of wanting to protect the integrity of the Black community through being intentional about not projecting the stereotype that had historically been unfounded in the form of slavery and Jim Crow. Enslaved Black people were denied a secure family life for a few reasons. They were considered property and could not legally marry, and the reality of families being torn apart due to family members being sold and separated. This is where the tradition of jumping the broom comes from. And this is something that we need to impact when we think about the makeup of the African-American family. It's not by design, or it is by design of why it's happening, and not just a traditional way of thinking of African-American single parenthood. This is where it stems from. Additionally, we see that many of the welfare practices that we see traditionally encouraged, just being for the African-American father not to be in the home. There was typically the process of social workers having to go in the home to check to see if a father was there. And this in turn encouraged Black fathers to not be an integral part of the community and gave the messaging that Black fathers were not important. So these are also policies impacting the family unit based on historical slavery and Jim Crow. Another implication for using physical discipline is what we see when we look at the foster care system. And so what we see is, although Black children make up 14% of the population, they make up 23% of the population in the foster care system. Typically what we see happening is sometimes when a case comes before Child Protective Services, they'll ask questions as it relates to assessing what happened that brought the child into Child Protective Services, and in general, what happened or the family dynamics between the parent and how they grew up. But what doesn't happen is an analysis of historically as a culture of why a practice is happening. So they don't understand historically why there is a prevalence use of physical discipline within the African-American community. For the sake of time, we're not going to do our activity number 2, but what I would like everyone to do sometime today is really just reflect on their personal culture or family dynamics, and if there's any cultural adaptations that have impacted parenting or family dynamics within your particular culture that can now be interpreted as dysfunctional or abusive from an outsider looking in, and just see how that kind of impacts that. No, your culture might not have done that organically, but how they've had to adapt due to any form of intergenerational trauma or race-based trauma. So I would like everybody to just kind of take some time and think about that for them personally. So now that we've talked a little bit about historical, social, and cultural adaptations, we want to also think about it in terms of ACEs. And I know that most of us may have heard of it, but for those who haven't, ACEs are called adverse child experiences. And it stemmed from a study where a Kaiser physician noted that typically one's exposure to traumatic experiences is one of the biggest factors influencing their mental wellness outcomes, and different self-medicating things such as using drugs, excessive eating, or engaging in risque behaviors such as like sex with multiple partners without protection, things like that. Not only does this pose a risk to the wellness of the individual, but it also has impact for society as a whole. And so when we think about trauma, one of the biggest things that we can see, the number one thing noted is physical abuse. And no matter the reason why a parent is doing it, it doesn't make up for the difference that it has an impact that is not for the well-being of the child and how they experience it on their end. I'm going to skip this particular video for the sake of time.
Hello.
One of the other things that we're going to look at is researchers has noted that violence begets more violence. There was a study that showed 31% less physical fighting in young men and 42% less physical fighting in women in countries where corporal punishment was banned in every setting, whether it was at home or at school or other settings. So we note that if you teach a child to hit, they're more likely to problem solve by doing that as well. According to the American Psychological Association, an estimated of 1/3 of abused and neglected children will later victimize their own children. Additionally, of all who were abused by a family member, 36% of them went on to be abused as an adult by their current or former partner. 41% of those adults had their child in the home who might have witnessed domestic violence in some form. And 34 of the 41% of children who witnessed their parent being abused will continue the cycle of violence and be recipients of domestic violence by their partners in the future. So we see just a whole lot of trauma happening all at once because of the exposure as a child. There's some next steps, but what I'll do is I will pause this and make sure that everyone gets the slide deck so they can kind of have the tips that are available to talk with your particular client and participants about. So what I'll do is I'll stop sharing and see if there are any questions on what was shared now. And I'll give it away to you, Martha.
Great, thank you so much. I don't have any questions in the chat, but I'll give everybody a second to type any questions they may have, or if you're comfortable, you can just unmute yourself and ask your question directly to Dr. Anderson. So any questions so far?
Hi, Dr. Anderson. I'm sorry. I have a question about, has there been any effort for Child Protective Services or any programs that do service those families to have this type of training where there's the historical context being given or taken into consideration when they think about treatment plans or whether they remove a child or not?
Yeah, so there's definitely some work with that, but what we're finding is it's CPS is a huge issue, but what we're finding is the biggest issue is really coming from reporting parties that are typically adding their subjective thoughts onto facts or based on their upbringing. So just because it looks different than you were raised doesn't necessarily mean that it's right or wrong. And just kind of being open enough and humble enough to come to a situation and ask those questions as to the why and getting a greater understanding of why, because sometimes it's a lack of knowledge. Obviously, definitely if there's a situation of at risk and it's too risky to even have broach those conversations with the parent, then by all means, please follow that protocol. But a lot of times it can be circumvented by having a conversation or bringing the educational piece. Tons of families that I work with are African American and have no idea as to the why or historical reasons of the community historically using physical discipline. So I think even having that conversation and broaching it, or having conversations of, yes, you experienced it as a child, how did that make you feel? Or did it stop you from doing this type of behavior? Did you feel heard? Did you feel listened to? Or did you just feel basically shut down by the physical discipline that was happening? So I think a lot of the brunt work needs to happen with teachers, with most of the mandated reporters, whether it's a hospital setting. There's just a tendency to just call and not have conversations, or not having a cultural lens to really put a fair assessment on whether or not it's abuse or not.
I have a
Thank you.
question in terms of the last slide that you mentioned about encouraging parents to do what's right and having them experience the natural consequences of that. Like, what can you provide an example? Like, I know it says positive, negative, neutral.
Like what would that look like?
Okay, so yes, what we really work on was in our teaching and having conversations with community members, we definitely give them the right to make decisions of what they want to do for a parent. But as I was saying, a lot of times, even with this use of physical discipline, many times they don't know the historical reasonings why. So after you educate them or after you have those conversations, it's really up to them to choose what they want to do in parenting, and then they will have the consequences, whether it be positive, like maybe they've opted to not utilize that and see the benefit of it that way. And negative consequences could be child welfare intervention. So that's definitely, we just like to give parents an opportunity to have full information, and then they're able to do with what they want to do with it. But we never want to, not give the information based on what we see a lot of times, like if it's a non-Black provider providing services to a Black family, like not having that as a barrier for clinicians or for case managers to feel comfortable enough to have those conversations with parents to say, yes, I'm not of this community, but this is my understanding of historically where this has come from. So definitely, if you're needing technical assistance from your supervisor on how to broach those conversations, but definitely not servicing a family and not being able to have those challenging conversations.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I do have a question in the chat for you. I can read it to you. What are some changes that can be made in public policies that protect children and take a cultural context into account?
Great question. So with my particular former agency that I worked for Sacramento County Child Protective Services. And so one of the things that they have really worked on is what they call culture workers. And what that is typically we have Hispanic, we have Native, we have Black, we have differing Latinx, we have different forms of Asian cultural workers. And what that is that parents have an opportunity as a part of the quality assurance process to request a social worker that identifies with their particular background. And so what we find is that when they're writing different reports and assessments to the court, they're able to include those very specific cultural or religious or context that a judge or attorneys might not be aware of to make the appropriate decision. And so, for instance, we had a parent that had a child come in for physical abuse. And so one of the charges, if you will, were that the child had like all these scratches like around his forehead. And so he had a culture worker, which was myself, and I was able to describe to the court that those were nicks that happened when he got a haircut. So it wasn't an issue of that particular thing wasn't an issue of physical abuse at all, but I was able to testify to something that happens in our community with regards to haircuts that might be misinterpreted as abuse as opposed to like a cultural practice within the community. A lot of times we see this with issues of like cupping or coining or different things that we're able to go to the court and say, doesn't necessarily make it right, but let's talk about the context of where this is coming from. And then we're better able to put implementations into it. Another thing that they're looking at doing more macro level is introducing, making sure that there is cultural humility training for all social workers, and not even social workers, but even from the front line, from office assistants, anyone who's having any type of interaction with families, to ensure that they're receiving this training. And what they're trying to do is do similar to what hospitals are doing, which is they're going to stop funding if this is not happening and implemented into practice. And so when people are hit with money issues, they're more inclined, unfortunately, to do it as opposed to a heart issue, but they do move a little bit quicker when there are financial consequences for not following suit.
All right, I've got another one for you in the chat. What are some good resources that can be shared with families that show BIPOC people? Positive parenting resources tend not to be culturally informed.
Great. So there's a couple things. There is a program that's called Effective Black Parenting, and it's from a program out of Los Angeles County, and it speaks to that. And so they have a program that talks to both the Black parents and also providers. So that's a great program. Another one is called Spare the Kids, which is through Dr. Patton, and it talks about positive ways of providing positive reinforcement for African Americans, which is very sometimes a unique standpoint. So it gives structure and often tidbits on how to practically implement these things and not utilize physical punishment. So I will put those resources in the chat.
Great. Other questions for Dr. Anderson? Feel free to unmute yourself if you have other questions.
I have another policy question in terms of, you know, as you were talking about over policing and just different justice system based upon race. And, you know, there's always that cross-reporting of child abuse investigations, whether it is a substantiated or unsubstantiated. Is that something that they're going to discuss about how they kind of, because once you have that on your record, you can't get rid of it, as far as I understand.
That is true. So definitely, I think the onus will kind of be more so on the reporting party to be more technical. And I think that's where a lot of the education comes from, because it's a consequence that you don't get rid of. So I don't know that I answered your question fully, but there is going to be the onus for reporting parties to be a little bit more, just as if they don't report, there will be the consequences coming from like misreporting as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering if there's going to be like a policy in terms of like, if it is unsubstantiated, is that something that they can remove? Because I imagine that anytime that a person wants to apply for a job, you know, like they do fingerprinting, they do all this stuff, and if that comes up, how could that impact then their future, you know, career, their attainment, and stuff like that?
It's a hard one, because it doesn't necessarily mean that it's not abusive, because it could be considered that, but it's also giving the full contextual explanation as to why. And so then also providing more culturally responsive care plans or case plans afterwards to kind of address the specific needs. So a traditional parenting group might not be appropriate for a parent that has is under investigation or trying to pursue getting their kids back, because it's very specific on why they were doing it in the first place. I had a particular mom who literally was an African-American mom who literally said that like the school was going to call the police on my son, and here I am trying to fix it, and they're turning on me and calling on me. And so she was able, it was a very specific report, and able to get her kids back in 3 weeks, because I literally wrote all those things that we talked about in the presentation about the school was calling the police on him. So it really wasn't that she was like anger management necessarily, it was a really protective factor in her mind. And so just having those real in-depth conversations to a judge who might be just really looking at the penal codes that are associated with it, or the child welfare codes that are really, really black and white, but there's a lot of times a gray area where we have to do our part in explaining it a little bit more and assessing at a greater length.
Dr. Anderson, since we're getting close to our time, I was hoping, as you know, most of the people who are here on our webinar today are parent coaches. And I'm wondering if you could give them maybe 1 or 2 tips or strategies that they can start implementing moving forward when they're supporting Black families. If you can kind of give them just a few, where do they start and how do they support the families?
Great. So one of the things I really like to talk with parents about is the difference between punishment and discipline. And so really the punishment focuses on the act and really just stopping the act, but discipline really works on a teachable moment for kids. And so really talking about, instead of saying don't do this, really sitting down with a child and saying, you know, mom really doesn't like you to walk right in the middle of the street because there are cars coming. So really taking the time to slow down and talk to the kids and have them know why, and really having the balance between being an authoritative figure, which is someone typically really like, authoritative figure, which is someone who's really harsh and a child is scared of, as opposed to authoritarian, which is someone that is more diplomatic and having a well-balanced disciplinary interaction with the child. So having those conversations with what you really want the outcome to be. Are you really just trying to scare a child and make them cow down and be scared of you? Or are you really wanting to have a child really have a reaction of understanding why you are not a fan of this type of behavior for them? And so that's one of the key things that we love to talk to our parents about. And then another thing we really want to talk to them about is really just making sure that we are pouring into kids as early as possible. That 0 to 3 age range is really, really important of pouring in what your expectations, your age appropriate expectations are for children at that age. What we find is when you're getting 13 is not really the time you want to talk about values and expectations, because they're a little far gone and the world has already had some type of influence on them, whether that's positive or negative. So you want to just ensure that what we call, it's a proverb that talks about, formulating the clay while it's still wet. And so we really want to talk to our parents about just really valuing that 0 to 3, specifically age range, where we can be most impactful with implementing the expectations we have for them and how the values we want for them to have in their life.
Great, those are excellent tips. I really appreciate you giving those to our parent coaches. I think everybody can make a commitment to do both of those things moving forward with the families that they serve, if they're not already, which I'm guessing a lot of our parent coaches already are. So thank you so much. I know we're at our time, so I want to be mindful of that to everybody, but I'll just close with a few things. I'm going to put a link in the chat right now for an evaluation. So please, if you have a second to fill that out, please do. It helps us form webinars like this in the future. And I'll make sure all of the comments get to Dr. Anderson so she's able to see your comments as well. So please do that. And if in the next couple of weeks, we'll put this recording up on the Stronger Families blog. So if you'd like to watch it again, or if you'd like to share it with any of your colleagues, we'll send you the link for that. And I'll pass on all the resources. And I believe, Dr. Anderson, your contact information is at the end of the slide set, correct? So we can, yeah.
It is.
Great. So then if you have questions or would like to reach out to Dr. Anderson yourself, that will be in there as well. So if everybody could please join me in a big round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Anderson, for being here. This is an excellent presentation. We're so lucky to have you here. We really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thanks,
everybody. Thank you. If anybody has any questions, always feel free to email me. Have a great rest of your day, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.